through 38. "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind."
Good morning, church. Can you imagine being asked what is the greatest joke ever told? And you had to figure it out. Well, it's been figured out, and it's not a very nice joke. It's on Facebook, and it's ranked by far the funniest joke ever told. It's about a lady that gets onto a bus with her baby, and the bus driver looks at the baby and says, "Man, that's the ugliest baby I've ever seen." And the lady's really upset, and she goes to the back of the bus and sits down, and she says to the man next to her, "That bus driver really insulted me." And he says, "You know what, ma'am? You need to go tell him that. Go tell him what you think about that. Yeah, give your monkey. I'll hold your monkey for you. You go tell him." And that's now very, very, very funny. You know, we live in a time when we are very divided because we look different, or we think different, or we speak different. For many years now, I've been the person with the accent. And, you know, generally people are okay with that. But every now and then, somebody will judge me for the fact that I'm too tall or too short or too thin or too broad, or my language or my color or something is different. And this is kind of where we find ourselves as a country right now. And we need to do something about it. If I had to ask you, how many of you feel very, very strongly about being a Republican? Or how many of you feel very strongly about being a Democrat? I bet some people will hold their hands up. Or how many of you feel very strongly that Judge Kavanaugh should not have been in, or that Judge Kavanaugh should have been in? Again, we will have very strong opinions, and that is just here inside this country. Well, what about when we take it a little bit further? How many of you would feel very strongly about what's going on in Afghanistan or so on? And see, so we get forced by things like this, where we get to judge each other, or judge each other's children, or judge each other's house or car. And this is what we're going to be looking at today. So Jesus is going to give us lessons, the most important lessons during the last quarter, and today we're going to start with one of the most important, the crucial command. If the whole world adopted this command, we would have no problems in the world. In fact, all wars would cease instantly. All conflict, all judging would cease instantly. And so if you have your Bibles open to Matthew chapter 22, and by the way, we'll be looking at all of these lessons for the next quarter from the book of Matthew. Excuse me. The first thing we'll see is that we'll need to love God. Second, we'll need to love our neighbor. And thirdly, we'll need to love our enemy. But we won't start with loving our enemy. We'll start with what is easiest. And Steve, thank you so much for the selection of songs this morning. They all just about had to do with this theme, especially the last part of it. Love the Lord thy God with all of thy heart. But a Pharisee heard that he had silenced the Sadducees. When they heard this, they came and gathered together. Now, what had happened in Matthew 22, if you look from verse 11, they came to Jesus. The Pharisees, the scribes were there, and they were arguing with him, and they lost the first round. Then he starts in on the Sadducees, or the Sadducees start in on him. You know, if a man has many wives and he dies and she keeps remarrying in heaven, whose husband, will she be married to? And so Jesus answers them and silences them. And so now, when they hear this, when the scribes and Pharisees hear the Sadducees have been silenced, and the Sadducees are not their best buddies, The Sadducees only believed in the first 5 books of the Bible, and they didn't have much time for the Pharisees and the scribes. But when the Pharisees and the scribes heard this, they come back, and they trying to trap Jesus. And one of them, an expert in the law, a lawyer, asked him a question because he loved him very much. Right? No. What's he trying to do? He's asking an open-ended question because he wants to trap Jesus. See, Jesus is popular, and he wants to cut Jesus down. And so, because they asked this well-known rabbi this open-ended question, no telling what will come out of Jesus' mouth. And so he's really excited about this. And it's a very clever question, because during those days, there was an argument about which of the 600 plus laws was the most important law. And so how is Jesus going to answer this? Nobody up till this point had ranked it. Now, we've had our scripture reading, and so we know there's more than one answer that Jesus is going to give. But he only asked Jesus one question. What is the numero uno, right? What is the number one? He's not asking him to rank number 2, but he's going to go ahead and give him number 2 as well. And so this becomes a very interesting debate. And this is the first of the controversial debates that Jesus has, open controversial debates. Verse 36, teacher. Now, teacher in Hebrew or in Aramaic was a same thing. It's the same word in Hebrew or Aramaic, was a term of respect. It was Ravi. So do you think when he's saying rabbi to Jesus, he was saying this out of respect? He's trying to test Jesus. So he's trying to catch him. He's trying to flatter him. He's trying to come in the back door, hoping that he will catch Jesus. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with, put your arm or your hand on your heart, church, with all of your heart. Now do this, your soul. With all of your soul. Now do this, with all of your mind. Now if you go to Mark chapter 12, and you look at verse 31, you'll see the parallel here, which is also with all of your strength. If you go to Luke chapter 10, you'll see the parable of the Good Samaritan. Well, who's my neighbor, the lawyer asks. And Jesus says, well, let me tell you who's my neighbor. And so there's an added discussion there, but even there, Jesus will add, with all of my strength. So what does it mean to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength? How do you love God with all of your heart? All of your passions, all of your desires, all of your appetites. Every single part of you loves God. In other words, no divided heart, no lukewarm heart, no compromised heart. You've seen a building that's been compromised. You've seen a bridge that is compromised. After years, you notice that compromised bridge or building will collapse. You mustn't have any compromise. You are built on the rock. There's nothing of you on there except Jesus Christ. No compromise with your heart. Well, what does it mean with your soul? Your soul is that part of you that God gave. He gave to you and to everybody, including the devil. He gave a soul, a life force, a being. He made you a being that will never die. Whether you end up in heaven or hell, your soul will never ever die. Either be in eternal punishment or eternal reward, but it will never die. So love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul. How about your mind? Your soul, your heart has more to do with your personality, with the mask you put on to the world, what you show the world who you are. Now, when it comes to this, it has to do with more of who you really are, your temperament, the inborn nature. Whether you are a person who likes to be around people or doesn't. This is your mind, how you think, how you compute. Whether you have a mind that never shuts down or a mind that gets easily tired. All of this, every single bit of you, of your intellect, belongs to God. Now, what does your intellect belong to? What are you really good at? What have you become an expert on? All of us need to be an expert in the law. In the Bible. See, this lawyer is an expert not in legal things like a lawyer today. He's an expert in understanding the Bible. Not just that, but he's an expert in knowing the Talmud and the Mishnah, which they quote as commentaries, equate to of equal value to the Bible. So he's an expert in all of these things. We need to be an expert in book, chapter, and verse. And then with all of your strength, obviously, with every single ounce of strength that you have. How many of you are kind of starting to fall asleep? I can get my voice like a counselor voice, real drowsy, really put you all to sleep, or starting to think about the food, He says all of your strength needs to be towards loving your God. This is the great and first commandment. So if I had to ask you, what is the best house in the world, or what is the best car in the world, or what is the funniest joke in the world, you might be able to say this or this. But that's not of any importance. If you want us to have peace in this world, then those things shouldn't be important. In fact, I think judging might be the number one problem that is against this law. See, I can't love my Lord my God with all of my being if I'm walking around judging myself to other things. God is what's going to be my measurement, and He's all that I want. There was a lady that was caught in a DUI, and she was in a lot of trouble. And so the lawyer was in court, and there was a state trooper, and the lawyer was interrogating the state trooper because the evidence was solid. And so he was trying to find out just any little thing that he could get his client out with. So he started off by saying, "Officer, did you have your lights on, those red and blue lights when you pulled my client over?" "Well, yeah, I had my lights on." "And officer, what did you tell her when you walked up to the window?" "Well, I asked her to get out the car." "Well, did she?" Something's wrong because he's hesitant in answering. At least the lawyer thought so, and so the officer said, "Yes, I asked her to get out the car, and she got out the car, and she steadied herself again." "I didn't ask you that. Just answer my questions." "And what did she ask you? What was the first words out of her mouth when she was out the car?" Officer said, "Well, she looked at my car and asked, 'What disco am I at?'" This world is full of trying to trap people. See if we can get something. I think my audio went out there for a second. Full of trying to see if we can get the edge on people. But that's not what it's all about. It's all about God. And the more you as a lawyer try to quiz God, to test God, the more you're going to come to the center. But God is not finished. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all of your soul, all of your mind, and all your strength. And here comes a second. And the second is like it. In other words, the second is almost exactly the same. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, God is not perpetuating self-love. He's not saying that you need to love. He's just saying as a fact, we're going to love ourselves. We're going to put clothes on ourselves. We're going to wash ourselves. We're going to put a house or a roof over over ourselves. And He's saying you need to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, remember, in the Good Samaritan that follows this, he says, "Who is my neighbor?" And Jesus says, basically, your neighbor is anybody who is in need. So who do you come across who's in need? Who is your neighbor going to be? Is it going to be somebody who, if you are a Samaritan, who is also Samaritan? No, it's probably not. It's probably going to be somebody, if they were awake, they would tell you to get away from me, you dog. Because that's what the person that Samaritan was treating would have said to him if he was awake enough to say that to him. But what he's saying here is you need to love somebody who is not like you. In fact, you need to love somebody who you ordinarily wouldn't like. Bill and I have been driving around for quite a while, and so we know each other pretty good. And Bill, we've been in a time or two where we've been in environments where there were political discussions, right? And never has Bill heard me say strongly this or this about politics. He's never heard that. In fact, what he's probably heard me say is we need to spend less time watching TV and the news media and getting all hyped up about what politicians want us to believe and more about this, right, Bill? That's it. That's the conclusion we always make. We need to get to know the Bible more, and this needs to be what we are passionate about, because when this is what we're passionate about, then Republicans, you wouldn't just love Republicans. Democrats, you wouldn't just love Democrats. In fact, what you would probably do is love people across the aisle, correct? And that's just in our country. What happens if we put the borders down and we go further off? How are we going to love our neighbor? You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the law and the prophets. Can you imagine being a Jew and knowing that you had to learn at least 600 plus laws? You need to know every single one of them. And if you messed up on even just the slightest of them, you're going to go to hell. Could you imagine how overwhelming that would be? I remember the first time somebody explained to me the difference between the new law and the old law, and I realized all I needed to really do to get to heaven is obey the new law. From Matthew to Revelation. That's all I needed. You see, I don't need to obey this. I realized I wasn't overwhelmed. I thought, I can do this. I can do this. And so you have this crowd of people, and the lawyer is trying to trap Jesus with all kinds of questions here, open-ended and very insightful thoughts. And Jesus just stands back and he says to the crowd, it's actually very simple, church, or people. All you have to do is know these two laws. Everything in your lives will be okay, and if you can condense it down to these two, and really, if you come to the crux of what the Old Testament was, that was it. No one had ever put these two together like this. They're not even in the same place in the Old Testament, but Jesus does, and he puts it together and says, this is all you really need. You know, I love little children. They're so honest. I remember there was a time when a lady who was a very influential church-going lady in a neighborhood asked the group of kids, the neighborhood kids, where they go to church. And they all said, the neighborhood, except one kid. He said, well, I go several cities down to another church way down there. And she asked the little boy, well, why do you do that? And his answer was, those people really love each other over there. Love is a very, very powerful thing. People will travel for miles and miles to come to a place where people really love each other. I often think about this congregation very favorably when I realize how eclectic we are. Represents 6 different mother tongues in this one little church. That's amazing. And if we throw Steve in the mix, it's Japanese too, right, Steve? So we're very eclectic. We cannot afford to just love people who are just like us, right? It would never work. We're a really nice group of people. And so we find these commandments very easy, to love the Lord our God and to love our neighbors. Doesn't come hard, I don't think, for this congregation. But how about this one? This is the tough one. Love your enemy. Who is the person that you can't get along with? Who's the person that goes out of their way to make your life miserable? Who's the person who knows just what button to push to get you to fly off the handle? Who is it that if they had an opportunity right now, if they see you walk in this building, they would walk out? Who's that? Could you love that person? And here is where it really is. Jesus is teaching the Beatitudes, and he says, you've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now, nowhere in the Bible does it say, it is said, hate your enemy. It must have been something that they were talking about. It must be something like in our culture, we could say, we don't generally like our enemies. We hate our enemies. It might have been a statement of fact. But this is what Jesus says. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Love your enemies. Is that easy? Chris, I see you've got your prayer book with you today, your little notebook. How many of your enemies that you have listed there on those prayers? See, that makes it interesting, doesn't it? A couple of weeks ago, Tom challenged us to carry around a prayer journal, and I've got mine in my case over here, and Chris has got his, and Tom's probably got his, and so on. And so we write down our prayers on a daily basis. But how many of us have our enemies listed over there? Generally, we don't do this. Well, Luke goes and puts it a little bit differently in chapter 6, verse 27. But I say to you who hear. In other words, not everybody's going to hear this. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. I was visiting with a lady this week, and she said, my boss really has it in for me. And you know, she earns minimum wage, and so in our day and age, with all the Amazon and all the jobs that are taken, if you're on minimum wage, you can just about ask your salary and your time and everything. And if you have a boss that's really mean to you, well, you can move. You don't have to stay there anymore. And what I told her was, what I told you many times before, is if you've got somebody you're really struggling with, why don't you go to Dollar General? Not because it's cheap. You all maybe think I think it's cheap. No, I don't mean go to Dollar General because it's cheap. Go to Dollar General and buy this person a gift. And the reason I say Dollar General is because you can keep going. You can go and get a gift every day just about for this person and give it to that person. You know, it's different when you're thinking I love my enemy, and it's to where you actually are doing good. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. And that's how we change our world. There was a man who lived a few years ago, and he had a lot to do with changing this world. Martin Luther King gave a speech one day, and it was about Abraham Lincoln, and you might have thought, well, there's a connection there. They were both assassinated, and that's true. But it had very little to do with that. It had to do with the type of person that Abraham Lincoln was. See, Abraham Lincoln, before he became president, he was running for president, and he had a man, Mr. Stanton, who was going all over the country and telling anybody who would listen how bad Abraham Lincoln is. He was saying things like attacking his character. He was attacking even the way that he looks. He says, who wants this thin, scrawny guy for their president? But eventually, Abraham Lincoln did become president of this country. And on becoming president, he started to fill his cabinet, and he was looking for a secretary of law. And so he looked all across the country, and he couldn't find anybody more qualified than, guess who? Mr. Stanton. And so he said to his advisors he was going to elect him, and his advisors said, you're a fool, Abraham Lincoln. You can't do that. This guy hates you. He says bad things about you at every occasion. You mustn't do it. But he went ahead and did it in any case. And after he was assassinated, one of the most powerful statements that was ever made about Abraham Lincoln was made by this man. And it was these simple little words. Now he belongs to the ages. And you can read some more when you go to Washington. Of all the things you're going to see about Abraham Lincoln are these words by guess who? Mr. Stanton. This is how Martin Luther King closed his speech. He said, if Abraham Lincoln had hated Stanton, if Abraham Lincoln had answered everything Stanton said, Abraham Lincoln would not have transformed and redeemed Stanton. Stanton would have gone to his grave hating Lincoln. And Lincoln would have gone to his grave hating Stanton. But through the power of love, Abraham Lincoln was able to redeem Stanton. The power of love is not about the funniest joke. It's not about trying to put a lawyer in a court and trying to trick the lawyer. Those are the things that the world does. The power of love is about me being nothing and everybody being everything else. The power of love says that today I'm going to be a blessing machine. Today I'm going to go about and I'm going to see just how many people I can bless. And I'm not going to look at who looks just like me. I'm not going to have any filters when I look. I'm just going to bless wherever the need arises. And this is the kind of church that I believe that we are. This is the kind of people that I believe we need to be. What would the world be like if everybody could look past and they could look like Abraham Lincoln said, you know, I'm not looking at what he said. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what they think about me. I'm just looking for what's good in each other. I think we'd be a much, much better place and a much better world. So if you want to answer the invitation today, understand that it's about nothing else than the blood. It's not about anything we've done. It's not about any mistakes we've made. It's just about who Jesus is and what the blood represents in our lives. If you want to be baptized today, it's because you would realize that you want to die to yourself. It's yourself that's causing the trouble. It's yourself that's saying you're better than anybody else. But once you've died to yourself, you look at your neighbor and you say, you know what, my neighbor is better than me. So you die with Jesus in baptism, you're buried with Jesus in baptism, and you're raised with Jesus to walk a new life. If you want to ask for the prayers of the church, if there's somebody that you're struggling with, or some issue you are struggling with, or you get this concept of love and you want to make it more real in your life, and you need the elders to pray with you, whatever your need is, please come forward right now as together we stand and sing.